So, welcome to our first lecture. It is not, however, going to be a lecture on the literature of the course. I know if you've read the syllabus, we're going to start with the Epic of Gilgamesh. I've talked about this in the introductory material. But today we're going to do some sort of groundwork, laying down some basic definitions, things that you needed to know, plus addressing, I think, maybe the biggest question you may have, and that is, why are we approaching this from a literary perspective? In other words, what can the study of literature, or more broadly, cultural analysis, which is what we'll be doing, what can that do to help us have a greater understanding of, something like environmental issues, climate crisis, or whatever? That's a fair question. And I think depending on how you've approached literature in the past, either in other courses or maybe high school courses, that may give you a somewhat, not inaccurate, but a different view of what we're going to do. So literary analysis is often focused on, not surprisingly, this study of literature. So you read a poem, you try to understand how it works, and by that I mean, you scan it, you see how the meter works, you see how the rhyme and that. And in general, you're looking at the work and achievement of a single individual in doing that. Generally speaking, we're not going to do that in this class. Don't get me wrong, there's some great literature. I will try to mention it when we encounter it. And we're going to start with what I think is a truly amazing piece of literature, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. But we're going to take a historical approach to the material, because I think that, for our point of view, if we're trying to understand contemporary attitudes toward the environment, which is the big goal here, that's the good way to start. So my go-to example for this has been for a while the fact that back in 1945, outside of a sleepy little New England town, an amateur archaeologist made a discovery, which was a little cabin where someone had lived about 100 years before. Now, if you approach that from the point of view of physical anthropology, archaeology, you may learn a good bit about, who lived in that house by looking at things like how the house was built, sort of trash that person had and all. That's fine, and that's good. But if there's something left behind that's different than that, something very special, and that is if there is an account of the person, something that person wrote, you can learn a lot more about that material, that person through that material. And in this particular case, we've learned a great deal about that person because the person living there actually wrote down an account of what it was like to live there. And that account takes the form of the book Walden. The person who lived in that cabin was Henry David Thoreau. By looking at that book, we can learn an enormous amount about how that person, Henry David Thoreau, related to the environment, his attitude toward the environment, his attitude toward culture, toward other people. There's an enormous amount that can be learned about that. So it's historical analysis, but it's not through physical material, but through literature itself. For as long as there have been people writing things down, there have been remarkable works that have recorded, what their relationship was to all sorts of things, including the environment. And this goes back nearly 5,000 years in Western literature. So what we'll be looking at is the very beginning of that. Not to look at these works as, particularly great works of literature, although they often are, but to see them as a chronicle of attitudes toward the environment at the time. Now, if you think of it that way, you can say, well, that's kind of interesting, but that's not that relevant today, right? I mean, whatever they thought about 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, how does that relate today? Amazingly, since we are approaching this from the perspective of Western culture, these attitudes, which may have emerged 5,000 years ago, or depending on what we're reading, 500 years ago, they're in some cases still alive and well today. So to catch them at the moment where they form is particularly interesting, I think, and will help us sort of unpack contemporary attitudes by looking at how they emerged over the years, really over the centuries, over the millennia. So that's an important, distinction to make here. The other thing to note is that we are approaching this from the perspective of the environmental humanities. And, that itself is a little unusual, I think, because many people, when they hear something like the phrase environmental studies, they assume that's environmental science. And they make that jump. It certainly doesn't have to be. All sorts of different fields, approaches, methodologies can help us understand something like the environmental crisis that we're in particularly the climate crisis. So that's how we'll be going about it. But let's just jump right into the Prezi, and we can get an idea of how this is all going to work. So here is our Prezi. And again, we're not going to start here with the literature. You can see the arc forming there. But I put this over to one side here because the introductory material isn't really part of the historical grouping of materials. But there you go. So without further ado, let's just jump right into, number 1 here. And, sorry about that. The Prezi's misbehaving. Here we are. So this is lecture number 1, and you can see this is what it's about. It's in, Introduction to the Environmental Humanities. I note that in addition to it being an introduction to literary criticism, that is also more generally environmental humanities. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But we're going to talk about 2 particularly big questions here, and that is why approach, environmental issues from, a literary perspective. I just talked about that a little, and I'm going to go into that in more detail. And then the bigger question, I think it's a fair one. I think it's one that a lot of courses don't really take up, literature courses. Why we read literature at all? So let's jump right in, but we're going to need to have some key terms under our belt before we get too far into it. So what is environmental criticism? What is it that we're doing? This is a course in environmental criticism, so just what is that exactly? These are good things to know. And hey, these are things that could well, and by that I mean probably will, show up on, the midterm. So there are different forms of literary criticism, lots of different forms. There are such as Marxist criticism, post-colonial criticism, queer criticism, feminist criticism. You may be familiar with some of these, even if not by name, sort of in a general way. So feminist criticism has been around for, like 50 years now. And you may know that, we can approach something like Jane Eyre, the Bronte novel, as one, a beautiful work of art, sure, but the way I was just talking about it as sort of a cultural artifact, we can see attitudes toward women, 150 years ago in England, what they were like, why they formed and all. And, that's approaching it from a feminist perspective. That's sort of given way more recently to what is generally called, or there are other terms for it, queer theory, which looks at just not a binary of men and women, but a more complex, a range of issues with the LGBTQ plus community and things like that. Post-colonial criticism, you may certainly be aware of that, realizing that, the whole thing that we're talking about here, the Western tradition sort of ends with a very powerful colonial era in the last few hundred years. And critics, of course, looked at that, trying to understand that era. And again, they could have looked at physical artifacts of it, sure is interesting, but so many texts, even if they were, about something else, told us a lot about that colonial era. Marxist criticism actually was one of the oldest of this group, sort of with early feminist criticism as well. It's a little misnamed because really what Marxist criticism was about was looking at class relationships, about, how people who, controlled money and power, how they, how that was playing out. So you could read something like Pride and Prejudice. Again, it's just this, beautiful work of art, but there's an awful lot encoded in there about who had money, how money was distributed, how it was working. And Marxist criticism did that. So I wanted to explain those because what happens here with environmental criticism is that we're doing the same thing, except, let me go into, jump to the next slide. And these slides, I know I mentioned it with the introductory material, but to be clear, if you're working with the PDF, you can just work through here to go to, lecture 1A2, which is where we're going now. Yep. And feminist critics there, they look at literary representations to understand how representations of gender and women have changed over the time. And certainly even from, early 19th century, representations of women in Pride and Prejudice, even to Jane Eyre, there is going to be a difference, and certainly making a jump today. And that's what's so interesting, because you can chart the emergence and evolution of those ideas. Those ideas actually evolved from, Austen's time to Bronte's time in a pretty big way, and certainly radically evolved into our era. So if you want to understand where some of these ideas come from, and feminist approaches is interesting here, you can look at it. And amazingly, right, here we are 150 or almost 200 years, about 200 years from Austen's time. But, those attitudes are still alive and well today. And it's kind of amazing how some of these things don't change and how some do, and how there's, an effort to reform some of these ideas. So, feminist criticism. To put it simply, environmental critics are interested in how representations of nature and the natural world change over time. What is our relationship to the planet? How do we think about our relationship to our environment? These, every culture has these. Even if a culture doesn't come out and articulate them and doesn't set, the top 10 ways we relate to the environment, they're there. And you can, if you look carefully, and that's what we're going to be doing, and we're going to, honing our skills at doing that. If you look carefully at literature, you can see those ideas on display. And make no mistake, they're changing over time. But I want to be very clear, there's not a clear evolution of things going on here. What I mean by that is not that there's not a simple story here. We used to call it like a grand narrative, where everything was nice and tidy and you could see a simple evolution going on. It's not like that. With the works that we're going to look at, they're spotty, things come, things go. Some works introduce or focus on particular issues, other works focus on others. It's kind of a hodgepodge. But if you put it all together and you try to learn from it as best we can, you'll see that there are emerging attitudes here, and those attitudes again are often alive and well today. So here's an interesting point. Same as with gender, these literary representations are not only generated by a particular culture, they play a major role in generating those cultures. And I call that a feedback loop. So what do I mean by that? Okay, you're an author born into an era. Well, like it or not, whether you're conscious of it or not, you are going to be writing down those beliefs. They're going to be coming out, they're going to show up in the way that you write your story. Even if you're Jane Austen, you're writing about, Mr. Darcy and Lizzie, you think that that's the story. Well, it is, but there's a lot else going on, and it's there. No matter who you are, you inherit those things. So my way of putting it here, those notions of gender and the relation of men and women, they're generated by the culture. You in that sense, in like the purest sense of this idea, the culture is sort of speaking through you. But there are works, great works, in my opinion. In fact, these qualify as the greatest works of literature, not because they're necessarily the most beautiful or the most perfect aesthetically, but because they can express ideas that are new to the scene. So what do I mean by that? Well, we could use Thoreau as an example. There was sort of brewing in Thoreau's era an environmental ethic, sort of an approach to the environment that will give way to the modern environmental movement. That wasn't fully there, though, before Thoreau. Why we're going to read Thoreau, and why it's a truly great work in my estimation, he not only inherits the view of his culture, and it's there, it certainly is, but he's writing something new. Think of an author, or any artist for that matter, great artist. They're sort of going out ahead of everyone else. They're going sort of looking into the future, and they're relating what they see in their work. In that sense, if they are true visionaries, the world will catch up to them. The world took a long time to catch up with Thoreau. It took like 100 years really to like the 1960s, 100 years after Walden was published, a little more. when suddenly people realized what he was saying. But, that's because he was sort of out of sync with his time. He was ahead of his time in a way. And in that way, a person like Thoreau actually plays a role in generating culture too. Culture is renewed by the efforts of someone like Thoreau, and he brings something new to the table, or at least consolidates something new, which is a modern environmental view. And that's what makes these works so interesting. And the works that I've selected for the syllabus are all pretty interesting in this regard. They're all saying something, at least the modern ones, saying something new. So again, they're not just sort of generated by a culture, produced by the culture, but they're helping reinvigorate the culture and do something new. There are lots of works like this. In my most recent book, I also draw attention to like how Frederick Douglass's book does the same, writing about the same time as Thoreau. This is what makes these people truly great writers, in my opinion. And again, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with aesthetics. They may not be the most beautifully written, beautiful books, most fun to read books. Those kind of books often aren't, but they can be very important books if we look carefully at them. So here's really the end game. If you want to understand contemporary America's attitude toward the environment, its literary history is a great place to start. You could just go into it and look at contemporary attitudes, or maybe you could go back 50 years or so and just look at that. Many courses would do that. I think many courses would start where ours ends. So ours ends with Rachel Carson, which is about 60 years old now. But our course is going to sort of look at a deeper history. And I've had any number of students over the years tell me after taking this course, even though they had read Rachel Carson before, and if you're an environmental studies major, you may know Rachel Carson comes up a lot, but even though they read Rachel Carson a lot, they didn't quite understand the backdrop or what was really happening in that work. And that's what we're trying to do here. And there are a lot of environmental issues. There are a lot of environmental debates going on. Even the debate over climate change, the way that certain people are denying it, certain groups are in deep denial of it, and other people are embracing it. Well, you might say, well, that has to do with modern politics, maybe just the last 10 years. Well, it does. It absolutely does. Sorry, there's a plane flying over top of my little cabin here. But it absolutely does have to do with those attitudes and what's happening in the contemporary world. But it goes back so much more. 2,000 years ago, what was happening, or almost 3,000 years ago in literature, had a profound impact on how some people are denying the climate crisis and others not in the U.S. today. So that's what we're going to, sort of the end game we're looking for here. Okay, so let's jump into this. What do environmental critics explore? Well, let's jump to the first slide. Environmental critics explore a range of literary periods. So we're seeing that right now, right? So 5,000 years or so of literature, all of it is up for grabs. So it's not like, again, you would just read something new or contemporary. And the reason for that is the literary responses to these issues have been around for that long. So not to be a spoiler and give too much away for the Epic of Gilgamesh, but that text, a big part of it is about deforestation, about major deforestation efforts that were underway at the very beginning of large-scale Western culture. Gilgamesh's city, Uruk, is the first great large city in the Western world. There are other great cities across the planet, but in the West, and we're looking at the Western tradition to try to understand American attitudes, it begins there, and it begins with deforestation. In fact, deforestation will follow Western civilization out of northern Africa, through Europe, into North America, and to the rest of the world. So if you want to understand how people first understood that and thought about it, because that has continued today, why we continue to do deforestation to the degree that we do today, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a good place to start with that. And similarly, if you want to understand burning of fossil fuels, the first, fossil fuel economy, was 400 years ago in Shakespeare's time. So even though it seems improbable we would learn much from that period, I think you'll see there's a lot to be learned there. So Yeah, so just to rattle off a few: deforestation, air pollution, endangered species, wetland loss, animal rights, rampant consumerism. They've all been appearing for a long time. Many of these issues for hundreds, in some cases thousands of years. So there's an awful lot to cover and a lot to be gained by approaching this material. So, yeah. The other thing to keep in mind, there's no particular genre, and genre just means type of literature that environmental critics focus on necessarily. So it can include poems, novels, plays, and even works that seemingly have nothing to do with the environment. So don't think that, we just have to look at novels or nonfiction or poetry. It's not the case. So I'm actually going to give you an example of a song here, and let me just tell you what the song is first. It's Nickelback's song Rockstar. I used to play this when I did these as live lectures, but since I'm uploading it to YouTube, I don't want to get stopped by YouTube for putting on a copyrighted song. And it's also the case that, I'm not a music critic, I'm a literary critic, but it's not really the best song. But the point is, it has something for us if we're interested from an environmental perspective. So let's just look at the main lyrics of that song. Okay, I'm not going to sing this. There's no temptation on my part to sing it. Okay, I'll just read it. I'm not even going to read it as exciting poetry because, it's not. I'm through a standing in line to clubs I never get in. It's like the bottom of the ninth, and I'm never going to win. This life hasn't turned out quite the way I wanted it to be. Tell me what you want. I want a brand new house on an episode of Cribs, and a bathroom I can play baseball in, and a king-size tub big enough for 10 plus me. Yeah, so what do you need? So it may seem that this I was going to call it a poem. It is a poem. It's a lyric. Let's just call it that. That this lyric has nothing to do with the environment or the climate crisis or anything of the sort. I don't think when it was composed that they were thinking environmentally. Maybe if they were, it would be different. But it is the case that even in an improbable case like this work can tell us something about our relationship to the environment. It can practically tell us a lot. And one of the things that goes with that is this work is not an anomaly. And what I mean by that is it's not like this is the only work that does it. I could have pulled any number of hundreds of songs that encode this sort of attitude. So let's break it down a little to see what we're talking about here. This life hasn't turned out quite the way I wanted it to be. So for thousands of years, as I note here, philosophers and all sorts of artists have speculated on what we want, what constitutes the good life. So, and some of the answers given, and actually I'm actually referencing things here like love and truth. This goes back to Socrates, and we're not going to be reading Plato directly, but we're going to read about him. The notion of truth, the aletheia, like this is considered the highest ideal of that culture, that what we should all want is to strive towards truth or a certain kind of very pure love. Honor has been very important. So if you've read, the Epic of the Iliad or the Odyssey, Homer, that like honor is everything there. Beauty is also huge. That's going to be from Socrates onward. It keeps popping up again and again. Equality is something more recent, but no less important, of course, where it becomes really talked about a great deal, like in the 18th century and all. So these have been the goals of, I don't want to say the goals, but when human beings have sat down and said, what is it that makes life meaningful? What is the most important thing in life? What should we be striving for? Again, philosophers have been coming up with all sorts of answers. This particular song also has an answer encoded in it to that question. What's the good life? Another version of the good life is success at obtaining and making a show of excessive wealth. This cannot be done. and we're going to talk about this in some detail, really in Western history, it hasn't been done, I'll put it that way, without exploiting other human beings and the planet. But that's the goal, right? So, I mean, of all these, amazing goals that people have been thinking about over the centuries, the goal here is to make a lot of money and to show that you have a lot of money, to make a show of excessive wealth. People are going to be critical of this particular view, and it keeps emerging over the centuries in a particularly strong way 400 years ago as the seeds of modern consumer culture are being laid. But that's the attitude here, right? There's no attitude here that, justice or fairness or equality or truth or anything like that is being strived for here. This person is striving desperately, the imagined speaker here, but that's what it's for. Okay, so that's what it's for. Yeah. The thing to realize, however, is that this contains not just a clear ideology, but it has profound environmental import. As getting this version of the good life requires that we exploit both other human beings and the planet's resources. There's no way around that. And that is not the case with those other things that people want to, philosophers thought we should strive for, like beauty or truth or equality. Those things don't have a price tag on them, but this does, not just, price tag in dollars and cents, but the cost that it will mean for the planet and for other people. And you can see right away that this attitude is not just worrisome, but disastrous, because it is built on the notion of exploitation and of sort of selfish exploitation, getting all that you can for yourself, irrespective of how it impacts other people and the planet. Yep. On an episode of Cribs, if you don't know, was an MTV series that I think is long over. I don't watch MTV, so I don't know. But it was a celebration of lavish lifestyle. So you would go to different homes of different famous people, and you'd see how they lived and how amazing it was and all. And I mention that because consumption of diverse resources is a cornerstone of the U.S. economy, and it's widely promoted in our popular culture, which we're now exporting to the world. So, I mean, it's U.S. popular culture, but that, quote, American way of life we're sending to the rest of the world. And what is that American way of life about? Well, it's not about those things that the philosophers cared about, like, justice and equality, but instead it's, having an incredible lifestyle that, maybe a house that's big enough for, dozens of people to live in. It's having multiple cars. It's all these things that, you rack up. But every one of those things has a climate footprint. Every one of those things requires resources, and it doesn't take you don't have to be very good at math. You can be a humanities person like me to realize that that's just not possible for everyone on the planet. And that's kind of the idea here, right? This is a competition. And in this competition, if you can show that you have all this stuff, well, you're a winner, and, you're imagined that way. And if you're not, unfortunately, the implication is you're a loser in this game. It's a very nasty thing for anyone engaging in it. Just, psychically, to even if you feel good about having achieved it, you must think at sometimes what the cost has been. And the cost is very high. And again, this is just a popular song lyric, but it's all here. This attitude is encoded in here, and it's written large. That's what this song is about, that lifestyle. Yeah. A bathroom, I can play baseball in, and a king-size tub big enough for 10 people plus me. For over 2,000 years, writers such as Horace, Ben Jonson, Henry David Thoreau have been enormously critical of the building of so-called trophy houses. These are what we would call today McMansions. 1 in 5, I hope I'm getting the statistic right. I'll be quoting it. Maybe I will be quoting it, the correct one, if I don't have it right, later on in the course when we get to either Sir John Denham or Henry David Thoreau. But I think 1 in 5 homes now in the U.S. is a trophy house. above 4,000 square feet. And, people have been celebrating excessive consumption for 2,000 years or more, and people have been critical of it. And Thoreau is especially critical of it, and we're gonna talk about that. But not this song. This song is a celebration of excess, and it's meant to be, so wildly portrayed it is unimaginable, right? A bathroom so big you can play baseball in it. You don't have to have a full-size baseball field to play baseball, I guess, but what bathroom could be that big? I don't know. Maybe the Cardassian folks have bathrooms that big. I don't know. And but the idea is this is outlandish supersizing of a lifestyle. The average American consumes 18 times more of the Earth's resources than individuals in certain low to moderate income countries. And some Americans consume over 100 times more. And that has not only consuming of resources, but it has a companion emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. So the average person in the United States, if you look across all of the 50-odd countries in Africa, and you added them up and got the average, even in the average person in the U.S. is emitting 20 times more greenhouse gases than the average person living somewhere in Africa, which is astonishing. And that's bad enough because that's average American lifestyle. But what if you actually bought into what this song is advocating, to supersize it as much as you could? Well, people have, and those folks are literally, both consuming resources of, 100 or multiple hundred times more than the average person on the planet. And then they are having corresponding greenhouse gas emissions, which is what's bringing about the climate crisis. That is a major problem, but this song is celebrating that, right? It's not that this song is ignoring it or something and just like not dealing with it. This song is celebrating, I don't want to put too strong an edge on it, but I'll just say it. It's celebrating a lifestyle that is destroying the planet. And it's making it seem like a good thing. And this is not an anomaly. Think about it. I'm sure you know lots of songs that do the same, and lots of social media and all sorts of other things that do the same. And we're being bombarded with that in our culture, and we're made to believe that that's an ideal, and many people accept it as one. But we have to stop and think about the cost, both environmentally and, culturally too, because we'll see these things, very often involve exploiting human beings as well. So, yeah. So expressed another way, 100 average Americans consume more natural resources than entire towns and large villages in other parts of the world. That's an astonishing fact, right? I mean, it's not like twice as much or 3 times as much, but we're consuming many, many times more resources. And if that, how can I put it? It would be bad enough if it were unavoidable, that if for some reason we needed to do it. Like folks that live in northern areas actually emit more greenhouse gases than people in southern ones. So, for example, the average American in Alaska emits twice as many greenhouse gases as the average person in the continental U.S., principally because it's just colder there and they're burning more fossil fuels to create heat. Okay. It'd be one thing if it were a required reason like that, but this is not required. This is not based on need. This is based on want, and a want of things. And that want is so great that it means that we are wildly disproportionately exploiting the planet. And again, this song is not, just ignoring it. It is celebrating that. It is really, and again, I hate to put too strong a point on it, but as you listen to my lectures, you'll know, I guess I do that a lot. This is celebrating the destruction of the planet. It is celebrating a lifestyle that is destroying the planet. It is selling that lifestyle as the American dream, which is not only for Americans anymore, but now is going all over the planet. So it seems like a simple little song, and it is a simple little song, but it's a lot more too. Yeah. The thing that's worrisome about this is we are not born with an intrinsic attitude toward the environment. It's not like, a baby suddenly knows how they think about the environment that they encounter. That is all learned. And human beings, we are cultural animals. We have communication and language that allows us to share attitudes. So cultural art, and it's not just things that you learn from your parents or you learn from your teachers, but of course we learn things all over the place. We learn things from songs. We learn things from social media. And unfortunately, so many songs and so much social media does exactly what, this song, Rockstar, is doing. They encourage us to want to be, one way or another, symbolically, a rock star, a Cardassian, someone that has all these things. That's the goal. That's the end game. But that's, environmentally, that's, not the goal. It's the opposite end. That's the one thing that we shouldn't do. That's the far out radical extreme that will destroy the planet the quickest. And yet that is celebrated as the American dream now. And when a child is born, regardless of what they may hear from other sources, so much in modern contemporary culture is selling this particular dream. It's not Socrates' dream of finding aletheia, truth or beauty or justice or equality. It's not any of that. It's this one. And those attitudes pop in, all over the place in mass culture. And they are what inculcates a child, what teaches a child to, how to respond to the planet and to other people. And I have to say, it's a pretty disturbing message if you look carefully at it, like this poem, like this song, which we could do a lot in greater detail. But I just wanted to give you sort of an introduction. Another way of looking at this is to ask this basic question: how do we know what we know? And in large part, we know what we know because of the culture into which we were born. In other words, we don't intrinsically know things. You don't intrinsically know that a cow is an animal that you can eat and provides food. Or maybe we have something encoded in us that we should try to kill animals and eat them. But you don't necessarily know any of that until you are told that by a culture. And human beings really, we're sort of general, we're not quite like computers, but kind of like that in the sense that, a human infant can be born in any culture on the planet and will grow into that culture just fine, learn that language, pick up that culture. And it's just the way it works. And the problem with that is, if there are things in the culture that are difficult, problematic, and worrisome, they will all be taken up by that child as being the most natural of all things. So if you are born into a culture where you think that, living a lifestyle that requires 100 times more resources and emits 100 times more greenhouse gases than the average person on the planet, if you think that's natural and right and what you should want, you'll do it. And culture is what provides that. So pretty disturbing. But again, keep in mind that, we might have thought that coming into this class, we're going to be reading like poetry to celebrating nature and all. We're not going to be doing so much of that. We're going to be doing more things like looking at poems and things that encode attitudes like the song does. I threw up here, I used to play this song too, Lord's Royals. An older song now, not as old as Rockstar. I could give more recent ones, but it was interesting because if you know that, you probably have heard it, maybe back in junior high or something. That work encodes a counter ethic, right? It's all about not wanting to be a royal, and not in the sense of wanting to be literal, like remember the royal family in England or something, but to want to be like an American royal, like a Cardassian or something. And it's rejection of that. So we don't have time for it. But if you go through that song, you maybe already know it. It is a counter ideology being presented. And when I first heard it, I was very excited about it. And there are other songs like this, and it's not like the Cardassian lifestyle is the only one. There are people, of course, challenging it, and it's always exciting to see it. But again, you might just hear, oh, I kind of like that song, and I like that one. Well, yeah, but these songs, there are messages in them, and there are messages in so much that we're going to read. So not only can you do something like analyze song lyrics, you can do the same thing with non-written texts, things like works of art. So in the next section, I'm going to just briefly show you a work of art and show you how this works. So this is a celebration of Niagara Falls, and this was made in the 19th century, and it's meant to promote a view of the environment about the time when Thoreau is writing Walden. So let's look at it in a little detail here. If you can see it here, I know it's kind of small. Those are the human beings on the scene. They're very tiny. And that should tell you something. They're imagining this work here by Gustave Doré is imagining a very small human presence because it's wilderness. I can tell you right now, if you've read Walden, this might even make sense to you. This is sort of a visual representation of what Henry David Thoreau is doing with Walden. He's one little person living on an area about the size of the whole UCSB campus, and he's a tiny presence there. So there they are, and the people, just to blow them up in a little more detail for you. And it's showing that the environment is so much more enormous. And this is what Romantic poets are very interested in, something we'll talk about called the Sublime. The notion that, human beings are a small part of the world, and, nature is so vast, so huge, so amazing. We know that's not fully true now, as we as a species have taken control of this planet in a huge way. But at the time, that was what was being represented here. So again, it looks like just an interesting etching, but there's more. The environment is not innately sublime. It's carefully constructed as such in this etching. So 200 or 300 years before, and we'll talk about this in detail, in Europe, for example, no one thought that a scene like this would have been beautiful. We have accounts of people like crossing the Alps in the 16th and 17th century. They were utterly frightened and thought it was a really scary place. So wilderness wasn't seen as something beautiful and wonderful, but actually was something very different, just the opposite, something frightening and scary. What's interesting is that this era, which is Henry David Thoreau's era, gave birth to the modern one. So the fact that, I don't know how many people, but millions a year, I presume, go like to Yosemite or the Grand Canyon to celebrate and see that, beautiful, amazing, sublime wilderness. And yet no one would have done that 400 years ago. It's just that we are now heirs to this modern environmental ethic that was forming in this period, in part because of works like this, and in part because of works like Henry David Thoreau's Walden. So, how is that being done here? And we'll be looking at artworks throughout, visual artworks throughout the term, but we can just see here, human beings are much smaller due to the use of perspective than even birds. So, if you look at the size of this bird here, the wingspan compared to the height of a person, it's intentionally much larger for a reason. It's meant to dwarf the human presence. It's a celebration of wilderness and expansive areas, which were still, at the time, available, like in the United States. And there's the bird. And you can see, I've actually brought these two out side by side. The wingspan of this bird, compared to that person, I think it's closer in scale to the wingspan of a small airplane than it is a bird. So clever device used here. Almost religious reverence for the work. So there are two people again, and religious reverence here with the staff and all. Doré would also illustrate the Bible, for example, in Milton's Paradise Lost. And this is, a biblical character here and all. Almost the same. And this, in fact, is very common, emerging at the time, certainly with like the British Romantic poets, which we'll look at, the belief that nature should be viewed with almost religious awe. That, in fact, John Muir will say it by the end of the 19th century, talking about Yosemite Valley, that it is actually a temple. There is no greater temple, no greater home of God anywhere on planet than the Yosemite Valley. And that's a remarkable shift, and we're going to talk about how that happens. But here, none of that is being said, but in the poem, you can get clear indications of that happening here. Yep. Yeah, and again, so I gave the example here of John Evelyn, who was in the 17th century, and he's traveling through the Alps, and he didn't like anything that he saw. He wanted to get out of there as soon as possible because he was fully aware that he could die in a place like this. So these attitudes are definitely shifting over time. Yep. So that's our game here. If we study these carefully, artifacts like this, we can learn a lot about a culture and its relationship to the environment. Even improbable things like a song can tell us a lot. A single work of art like this can tell us a lot. Yeah. The goal of the course is to understand how the perspective of the environment that we have inherited. And one of the things we have inherited, and one of the reasons I gave you this, is the notion of nature as the sublime. And if we didn't inherit this, there wouldn't be millions of people going to places like Yosemite and, Grand Canyon every year. But to see what that means for us today, that's not a bad thing, actually, that Thoreau and people before and after him created this notion of wilderness as wonderful and even maybe like a religiously important place, because it makes us want to preserve it and care for it. So John Evelyn, writing at the end of the 17th century or mid to end 17th century, I don't think the attitude that he had would have made anyone want to preserve the Alps, if you read his account of it. But if you read John Muir, you're going to really want to preserve an area like Yosemite, and maybe, more generally want to think about and caring about the planet as a whole. So let's go through a couple things relatively quickly, some useful ideas. So what we're doing is called environmental criticism. It's also known as green criticism. That's typically like in Europe, they call it that. Or more often, which is why the course I also called Ecocriticism 101, we call it eco-criticism, which is a contraction for ecological literary criticism. It doesn't necessarily have to be literary, because remember, we're just looking at an artwork. So maybe a better way of putting it, I probably should have put it on this slide, is a contraction for ecological cultural criticism. And it's just a way of trying to understand our relationship to the planet, features of the planet, and all through a type of criticism, a type of cultural analysis, which is what I was talking about at the very beginning. So just know that when you see these terms, and you will encounter all three, they're all basically the same thing. And eco-criticism, even though people often will talk about it as ecological literary criticism, it's a more expansive term that's a form of cultural criticism. But one thing to be very clear about, by environment, we mean any sort of environment. And we can talk about a built environment, like a farm, a suburb, a city, or a wilderness. So, and again, like that Nickelback song, it doesn't have to be a celebration of wilderness the way we saw with that etching by Gustave Doré. It can be about what's happening in a city. And in fact, cities are particularly interesting now because 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions on the planet caused by human beings are coming from cities. So if you think about it from that point of view, from a climate point of view, it's great to think about wilderness and care about wilderness, but we're in a new era from Thoreau and Doré now, where we want to also look at places like cities and suburbs, because what's happening there is impacting the planet more than what's happening in wilderness in many cases. So we're going to look at all sorts of places. The example of Nickelback's song Rockstar makes clear, I hope, that's why I gave it, is that we're not just going to look at so-called nature writing. So you might have thought that this was going to be, before taking it, a course about poems like Wordsworth's Daffodils, which is a poem about daffodils, and that sort of celebration of nature. There's not going to be a whole lot of that in this class. And when we do look at the work of Wordsworth, we're going to be sort of interrogating it to understand how attitudes are changing, rather than just taking it at face value and saying, oh, we should all celebrate, things like daffodils, which we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't. But just be clear that we can be looking at any number of different types of literature or works of art, and even some that might not at face value, like Nickelback's song, say much about the environment. They can say a great deal, which is why we have to kind of look everywhere that we can for interesting things. Also, just to be clear on the word ecology, so we have, eco-criticism is ecological cultural criticism. Well, what's ecology? So that word was coined in 1866. People once thought that Henry David Thoreau coined it, but he didn't. They looked through his notebooks, which were handwritten, and they saw a word, and they thought it might be ecology, and they immediately, I think, wanted to see the word ecology, but it's not the word that was there. It's a long story, but you don't have to worry about it. But Ernst Haeckel is a German biologist, and this is right about the time, right after Darwin had introduced his theory of ecology, of biology and evolution. Hegel talked about ecology suggesting that all life on Earth is related. So in other words, biology, bios is life, and ology, of course, is logos, the study of life. It's two Greek words. That's great if you want to just study one particular form of life, like a frog, you would learn all about the frog's biology. But what about if you want to study the whole sort of swamp that the frog lives in with all sorts of other creatures and plants and all? Well, Hegel realized that really needs to be like another field altogether, where we talk about all different sorts of biologies and their relationship to things like the atmosphere, to the water in the swamp and all that. So that's what ecology is about, and that's why ecology frequently talks about an ecosystem. So it's a whole system of all this together, the water, the frogs, the flies, the plants, all of it. And to Hegel, we had to think that way. And it's really a transformative thought, because we really need to think that way right now, right? The way the planet is encountering global climate change. We have to think about a holistic view of the ecology of the planet. Just so you know, ecology comes from two Greek words, which is oikos, means household, and logos is study. So it's not necessarily the best. There are other Greek words that Hegel could have used, but I think he liked the idea of thinking about an ecosystem as being like a single house where there are lots of different people living in it, and we have to take into account all the people that live in there, where all the life is in there. So it can be in a localized sense, right? Ecology, you can talk about the ecology of a swamp, and a particular swamp, because regions have their own climates and all sorts of factors. But we can also talk about the ecology of the planet Earth, which is really what we need to do now with climate change, because it's changing all across the planet. That's not to say that there aren't regional differences with climate change, too. One of the hottest accelerating places in the continental U.S. has, in fact, been Santa Barbara County. And it's been argued, and I deal with this in the other course I teach, that Ventura County is, in fact, the hottest, has been up until today, anyhow, the county in the U.S. that's getting hotter quicker than anywhere else in the continental U.S. So, but anyhow, that's what ecology is. Good words to know. So this is the question, right? I mean, besides, all the particulars here, why approach environmental issues from a literary perspective? Why do what we're doing? That's the question. You could approach these issues from other perspectives, such as eco-philosophy, eco-psychology, eco-theology, or the hard sciences. All these are fields now. So pretty much you name any field, say history. Well, environmental history is a field. So just like there are people just like me, instead of working principally with text, they work in all sorts of fields. So why not approach it from one of these other perspectives, or in fact, the sciences? Well, first, let me be clear. Each of these approaches is valid and useful, but also not just that, but crucial and important today. So that's one of the reasons that this course will actually look at, and one of the first things we're going to talk about is eco-theology, and how theology, as improbable as it may sound, has a lot of environmental import here too. So I'm not saying that any of these things are not valid. In fact, we're going to be doing some of them. But I do want to make a case here, and let me jump in here. So we're going to be doing eco-philosophy. Actually, when we get to the Greeks, we'll be doing that with Socrates. Eco-psychology is sort of shot through the whole course, eco-theology, and environmental history we'll be doing as well. So these are all very important, and I don't want to dismiss them or dish them or anything. But there's something about what we're doing. So let me jump to the next slide. I'm not saying it's better, but I am saying what we're doing, the sort of literary cultural analysis, brings something new and different to the table. It's unique. Again, it's not saying it's better, but it is unique, and why I think it's important to do. So we conclude with this slide. To understand that, I think instead of, just stopping at this question of, why we're taking this approach, we need to even ask a more basic question about our approach. What is unique about literary approach? And that question here is the second one I have here, which is, why do we read and study literature at all? So there are a number of different reasons for this, right? You probably know some of them. Let me just pop a few up here. Well, diversion. This is why we watch and binge watch TV, because it's, you have a long day, you're tired, you just want a diversion, take your mind off of things. I'm not saying, and people have, by the way, read for this reason. Before there was TV, before there were films, there were books, and novels especially can do that, and that's certainly great. And I'm not in any way diminishing the importance of or significance of that. And we do it for pleasure too, right? So it's not just that we're sort of mindlessly watching what we're binge watching. It can be sort of a vicarious pleasure. You put yourself in that novel, you develop relationships with people, literary characters, I mean, and that can happen. And there's nothing wrong with that. Reading can and should be a pleasurable activity. I think if it isn't for you, then you probably don't like reading very much. If it is, then you might like reading a lot. So that's a good thing. It can be an impetus for reading. And hey, you want to read for, to be educated or even sort of edified by what we read. And, in different ways we do that, even if we're not trying to understand a previous culture or understand, the great artistic achievement that is the novel Jane Eyre. We still want to get things out of it and learn things, even if it's just perspective on the world. So that is a great thing. Yep. Now, here's a longer one. To understand human nature, and that's insofar as human nature and what we value, such as beauty, does not change over time. We call that new criticism. That's a form of literary analysis that was around. It's been around for most of the 20th century, one way or another, but it comes to sort of a head at the 1960s or so. And then it's supplanted. So, in the 1970s. So they call it new criticism, but it's not new. It hasn't been new for 50 years, but it was new at the time, so the name stuck. So I note here that the most conspicuous feature of new criticism is that history is largely irrelevant. So beauty, for example, presumably does not change over time. That's the argument here in new criticism. And it's still alive and well because, you may have even had it in high school or something. What I mean by that is, say we're talking about love. The notion is that love doesn't change over time. That, if Shakespeare is talking about love 400 years ago, one of the reasons we think he's so great because he really understood love, and it makes total sense from reading about that. We could go back, and we're going to look at Shakespeare, actually reading one of the plays, but we can go back to Sappho, who was a writer, 7th century, before the Christian Common Era, and what she was writing about was love too. And people say, well, yeah, love transcends all. It doesn't really change over time. So that's why Sappho and Shakespeare still resonate for us and we still find them beautiful. That's the argument of new criticism. But let me just go back and pop back for a second and explain that a little more. There's a difficulty there, though, right? And that is, and it's why new criticism sort of went by the wayside. Well, and that's because love is different for Shakespeare. Shakespeare, writes about a love for a young man, same-sex love. Sappho is totally writing about same-sex love. And, is it all love? Is it all beautiful? Yeah, but it's different. And to assume that it's all just the same is kind of a mistake. So, to understand history, this is another reason to read, and that's to learn about a past culture. To do that, you have to do a lot. So if you're trying to understand Shakespeare, you have to understand a lot about his era and how it existed and all. And that can be interesting if you want to learn about Shakespeare's era, if that's the end game and the goal. But as I note here, it had problems. It's time consuming. It's difficult to teach this in like a classroom because you have to, instead of just reading a play, you have to spend, weeks and weeks and weeks giving the backdrop for the play historically and all. And it's difficult because it doesn't really have a payout for us today. So like the end game, the thing you walk away with is you understand Shakespeare's era. Well, that's great. But how does that impact us today? Exactly. So that kind of historicism is kind of an issue. And I note that all of these are valid, right? For reading for diversion or pleasure are valid. New criticism, seeing the commonality of the human experience, valid. Trying to understand past culture is certainly valid. But this course is going to take the position that there's something more important. And here's another long slide coming up. Oh, there will be. To understand our culture today in the third decade of the 21st, in the sense that, we learn about the past of our culture, how we got here, and attitudes that are often encoded in our culture that we may not even be aware of. So that's the approach of something called new historicism. So let's jump to that. Even beyond that. So to understand our culture, great. To understand 21st century American culture, great. But what if you could understand our own attitudes? What if you could take apart why you actually care about Yosemite? You may not, you were born into a culture where people value it. You value it too. That was the most natural thing in the world to happen. But why do you? And it is interesting, I think, to interrogate our beliefs, especially because they're not always ours. We've inherited them from our culture. And new historicism, and partly in the way that we're going to be practicing it, can do that. I should note, however, that I'm putting this under the general rubric of new historicism, which has been around like 40 years. But I really mean culturally informed historicism, which has now branched off into a whole range of different fields in the last 40 years. But it at root involves this sort of cultural analysis with a historical basis for it. So let's do new historicism, the last of our slides, or sections. Came on the scene right around 1980. It's still enormously influential, but again, it's not new. It's 40 years old. But you won't necessarily find a ton of people saying that they're new historicists, and if anything among literary critics, they'll tell you the problems with new historicism. But what it did, however, and what it lives on with it, is it put a huge focus on culture. And so much so that if you ask someone like me, what do I do? Am I a literary critic? Yeah. But more than that, I think of myself primarily as a cultural critic. I would argue that new historicism and sort of things that came before, like early so-called first wave feminism or Marxist criticism, set the stage for that today. So it's not new, but it still lives on in the form of a historical cultural analysis. It's like traditional historicism because it requires a great deal of research. You have to understand an era. Like if you're working with Shakespeare's era, you have to understand the era very good, and it's hard to teach for that reason. And it uses history to interpret the present. So this is the difference. In traditional historicism, you use that history to understand it. So you use that history to understand Shakespeare's era. New historicism promises, and this is in part by a guy named Michel Foucault, who was very influential and kind of made modern new historicism happen, that, you can not only understand something about Shakespeare's culture, but about our culture today. And that's a big payout, and that's why it's different. And then both of these I covered in the previous slides, but to say it again, not only our culture does it help us understand, but by looking at Shakespeare's era, it helps us understand even something like ourselves. And in fact, I mentioned, Shakespeare writes about same-sex fascination or love. Michel Foucault argued that, sexuality itself has a history, and he wrote it. And people have updated that. But the whole notion that something like, beliefs about something like, say, same-sex love, how does each culture deal with that? And each culture deals with it in different ways. And it's fascinating to see. So in that sense, if you want to understand where 21st century American attitudes towards something like that or toward the environment come from, its history and its literary history are often great places to start. So I want to visually show this. This is traditional historicism. What do? We use old texts, and I'm going to give an example of Hesiod, one of the first people we're reading, to interpret. Another word for interpretation is hermeneutics. So this whole thing is a science of interpretation, often called the science of hermeneutics. But to interpret what? Historical cultures. So note that everything is going in one direction here, back from the present back to an earlier culture. In this case, we're going back nearly 3,000 years. So what's the promise? That, it provides considerable insight into past cultures. And again, like with the example of Thoreau's cabin, archaeology, physical anthropology just aren't going to give you what a text can give us to understand a previous culture. So it's enormously important in that sense if your end game is to understand an older culture. New historicism. Same thing, exactly. But, the historical culture here is, say, the Greek culture, and through Hesiod, he talks about a belief in a golden age, which is like Eden, when the earth was a perfect locus amoenus. We're going to focus on that word locus amoenus. It just means pleasant place. So what does that prove? Doing this sort of traditional, and this is just traditional historicism here, use this text to understand that the Greeks had this notion of a golden age, of a time where human beings had a perfect relationship with the planet. New historicism goes further, however. It allows us to interpret, but now we're going back from the past toward the future, toward the present, our present day culture, our ideas, and ourselves. So in this case, you believe that human beings once had a perfect relationship with the earth, which is by no means innate. In other words, infants are not born with that notion. We're taught that. It's culturally constructed, in part because of the ancient Greeks. It's in part because of the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Bible. This notion that human beings once had a perfect relationship with the planet. As we're going to see, there's not a whole lot in the historical record to say that that was the case. In other words, early human beings, whether it's 3,000 years ago, 5,000, 10,000 years ago, where was this perfect time when everyone had it all figured out? And it's not clear that it existed, but it does exist in the minds of many people today because we've inherited it from this tradition. And that's, it can be a problem, but it's most importantly, a good thing to know, a good thing to realize this. By the way, this whole thing, because now you can see what we've done here by looking at this older culture and then realizing that it can help us understand our beliefs today. We call this, going back to interpretation being a hermeneutic science, we call this a hermeneutic circle. And what this means too, you could go back and reread Hesiod and go back here again, and it would be illuminating because it helps you understand modern attitudes as well. So It's been around. New historicism's been brewing, I would argue, and I think I have argued, for 500 years, beginning with someone like Martin Luther, certainly with Friedrich Nietzsche, Edmund Husserl, and then his student, Martin Heidegger, Hans-Georg Gadamer, the student of Heidegger, Foucault, at least in spirit, the student of Heidegger, and Stephen Greenblatt is a guy who coined the term New Historicism. But it makes clear that this cultural analysis by way of an historical interpretation of literature brings something unique to the table. And that's something unlike the hard sciences and all, or really any field of inquiry, because it promises to help us understand our culture, our ideas, and even ourselves more fully, as I've been saying. So, New Historicism, or this general, again, I'm calling it that, but know that I'm meaning like a cultural analysis and much more modern approaches to New Historicism in a way. It answers our question. So why do we read literature at all? Diversion, pleasure, sure. But we read literature in order to better understand our culture today. So why do you read Shakespeare? If you want to read Shakespeare just to understand, the Renaissance, that's fine. If you want to read him just to read a beautiful writer, that's fine. But you can understand more about our culture and ourselves by reading him if you read him in this way. So it's not dusty old history at all, but a relevant inquiry today, and one that can be very personal, I think. And it underscores, at least should, the value of literature. So yes, literature is great and wonderful and beautiful and all. Totally great. But it has something more. It has a far, I'm not going to say a greater value, but a different value, a bonus value, that if we look real carefully, and that can be very helpful at a time like this when we're trying to understand how we got into this crisis, the climate crisis. So why approach environmental issues from a literary perspective? This will give us a better understanding of, how our attitude toward the environment historically emerged. Both in us as we have, inculcated, taken those views on, but as a culture as well, where they came from. So if your goal, and I hope it is in some ways, to try to understand the climate crisis better, where we are environmentally right now better, this course is designed to help you do that, both by analyzing our culture and where it came from, but in a more personal way, I hope that it'll encourage you to analyze your own views toward the environment. And one of them would be the example we just gave by way of the explication of hermeneutics and New Historicism, that, the notion of a golden age, that, once human beings had this perfect relationship to the planet. You may believe that. Many people do. And it's not like this project has ended, right? If you've seen the Disney film Pocahontas, which my young daughter likes, that's the same attitude there, that there was once a time where human beings had a perfect relationship with the planet. It's no longer being postulated as the golden age in Greece or the biblical Eden, but something more recent. And not saying that, Native American people didn't have wonderful relationships with the planet, but it's not quite the same as what's being said in something like Hesiod or the biblical account. But why are we so quick to believe it? Because we've been sort of set up to believe it from things like Hesiod and more influentially in some ways the Bible. Yeah, it's arguably the case that no other discipline or field of study can offer this sort of relevant and important cultural payout. So I was trying to be so equitable in saying that every other field is equally important, and on here I just went and said that English can offer more than any other field. I don't know that that's true, but it can offer a lot. And I think if we go into this with an open mind, seeing what we can learn about our culture and ourselves, I think it'll be a very fruitful enterprise. So, and let's see, did we just get through? Here we are, and we're out again, and let me pop back on here full screen. So there you have it. The goal of the course is not just to look at pretty literature. Some of the literature we look at is not very pretty. The goal is not to understand previous cultures, although we're going to be doing that and looking at pretty literature. But the bigger goal is to try to understand how we got here, how we got to this particular moment in history because of the underlying thinking. I'm not going to make the strong argument right yet that Western thinking was sort of destined for this to happen, the crisis that we've been in. But you can see that there have been monumental changes in thought that predisposed us to where we are now. And it will not be really the focus of this course. And in fact, there's another course, English 24, that handles this. But we really need to think about how to address this problem by addressing the underlying thinking here. In other words, if the thinking is so important, and it is, especially since we've taken it on and we believe it ourselves, how then do we go about shifting this? In other words, if we want to solve the climate crisis, it's not going to necessarily be just about wind and solar. I think they're both great, but it's going to be about shifting the way that we think about the planet and how we encounter it and how we enact that as individuals, as ourselves. Okay, so next time we start in with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is an absolutely wonderful text. Okay, take care.